Christe agam cretit, simdilisa, dam cum velidas ablave vicinatas forevis mimdiceveli. Christe agam cretit, simdilisa, dam cum velidas ablave vicinatas forevis mimdiceveli. Agam Christem cretit, simdilisa, dam cum velidas ablave vicinatas forevis mimdiceveli. Christe agam cretit, simdilisa, dam cum velidas ablave vicinatas forevis mimdiceveli. Christe agam cretit, simdilisa, dam cum velidas ablave vicinatas forevis mimdiceveli. Christe agam cretit, simdilisa, dam cum velidas ablave vicinatas forevis mimdiceveli. It was a very narrow hourglass of a moment when these manuscripts, if they've been discovered by the wrong person, they could have just been in the bonfire. And that would have been hundreds of years of musical oral tradition transmitted by generations of singers in multiple regions and schools of Georgia just go up in smoke, because there was only one copy at that time in the 1920s and 1930s. And there was only one monk paying attention to this whole tradition, whose name is Saint Ekftime the Confessor Karaselidze. He was not a trained musician. He was a simple, uneducated worker in a printing house. But he fell in love with Georgian chant, and he was self-educated with some other guys. They formed a club, and they hired a chanter to come and teach them to sing. And the press dissolved. Everyone that was involved died. And this humble press worker finds himself with piles of manuscripts. And so what does he do with them? He decides to become a monk, moves to a monastery, organizes them, rewrites them all. He buried those manuscripts in tin boxes underground. He was constantly under fear that he would be killed. But luckily, he was found by some museum director in 1936 who convinced, at this point, the old monk to give up the manuscripts. And that museum director put him in the National Archive, and didn't label the manuscripts accurately.
Really?
He gave them each a number, Q696. That's it. This archive director, who then gets shot the next year by Beria, 1937. So hardly anyone remembers that these manuscripts are there. Our old monk up in the monastery on the mountain, he writes his memoir, the one that I started translating in 2004, and then he dies of old age in that monastery alone. Shishkhati choir members found them like 1980s, and we started publishing them in the early 2000s. Now there are thousands of people that have access to this music.
Today I'd like to welcome John Graham, who is probably the English-speaking expert on Georgian Orthodox Chant. I don't know of anyone else that would be a bigger expert than John Graham on Georgian chant. So thank you for being here.
Small group of us. But thank you for the introduction.
Yes. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
All right. Well, I live in Georgia. I'm a musicologist by training, and but now I run a tour company specializing in cultural tours to this part of the world, the Caucasus generally, but also leading tours to other places like Ethiopia, Sicily, Turkey, and other kinds of tours as well. There's birding tours and hiking tours and boating tours and all sorts of things. But my true passion is Georgian liturgical chant, which is what I think we're here to talk about today. That's how I first came to Georgia. I fell in love with the music, and then after coming here some 21 years ago, then I fell in love with the culture and the mountains, the language, and the Orthodox religion, and that's led me to be here all these years since.
How'd you find Georgian Orthodoxy to begin with? What sparked your interest?
Well, it was really the music was the gateway. I've always been a sacred music singer, and I found myself at the end of my undergraduate years needing to do a senior recital. So I was directing a small choir. This was at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And we were studying sacred music of the medieval Latin West, Gregorian chant and organum polyphony from Notre Dame, and Winchester tropar, and other early sort of Catholic musics, which I love. And I had a background in Episcopalian English music. I'd grown up singing in a men and boys choir. Fairly difficult and beautiful repertoire, mostly 18th, 19th century. So then I was doing research on other sacred musics of the world, and I came across a CD in the library of the Rustavi Ensemble, Rustavi State Ensemble of Georgia, and they had a few pieces of sacred music on there, specifically Tsmindau Romerto and Shenchar Venachi. And I was just blown away with these pieces. The first time I listened to them, I remember being in the university library with headphones on and just wanting to play it over and over and over again. And especially since I was leading my own project, directing my own choir at that time, I was really excited to be learning and studying anything having to do with sacred music around the world. So it was like the right time to hear that music, and I got so taken with it that I transcribed Tsmindau Romerto right then, that first sitting, into notation. The next day I had rehearsal with my choir, and we sight read through it, and all of my singers loved it too. And so that started my obsession with Georgian music. Then I checked out every CD that was on the interlibrary loan system. I tried to find anything written about it on the internet. There's precious little in English. There were some articles or encyclopedia articles on folk music, but almost nothing on the sacred music. And that's where it all started. I changed my senior project to just do Georgian chant, and that choir, together with that choir, we learned 30 chants over the course of the year, and we're pretty serious. I'm really indebted to those singers, my friends, for going along on that journey with me to begin with, and showing up at rehearsals ready to work, and I always had a new piece. And so by the end of the year, when it came to the recital time, we got to choose, say, 15 out of the 30 that we'd learned, or the best ones, and we did a few concerts, made a CD. And then after graduating, I could have left it at that. I could have said, fun project, now time to go on with life. But I really felt a calling to learn more about this music. Why was this so appealing to me as a musician, as a singer? What was behind this language, this polyphony, this religious spirit that generated this kind of expression of prayer to God? because that's what, liturgical chant, it's a prayer really. So what culture generated this particular prayer? That was my question when I was 23, 24 years old. So that led me to come to Georgia that next fall after I graduated. That's where it started, fall 2003. That's when I first came over here.
Okay, wow. And so I think I heard you say you were looking for Gregorian chant, but then accidentally found Georgian chant because it was a typo?
No.
Sort of like that?
Well,
which would make sense because anytime I talk about Georgian chant, people get confused and they think that I'm talking about Gregorian chant. So.
Yeah, especially AI gets confused now. It gives you all the wrong Google results when you type in something like Georgian. But no, I knew about Georgian chant, and
okay.
I knew about Gregorian chant from when I had been singing in the boys' choir. We sang plain chant, plain song, like in the Episcopalian service. This was not too dissimilar, and having studied music, I was a music major. I had sung Gregorian chant and plain psalm singing and so forth. So that's where I started my project. But then when I discovered Georgian and I changed my senior project to Georgian chant, I always joke that my advisors never noticed the difference because I only had to change one or two letters in the title. And,
right.
They were letting me do my own project anyway without too much oversight. And so I think the Georgian project turned out to be a lot better than the Gregorian ever would have been. There are a lot of professional choirs singing Gregorian chant. We would have never matched their musical ability. And in terms of the scholarship, there are hundreds of books written about every single manuscript in which Gregorian chant has been transmitted. So I wasn't very inspired to write a thesis on Gregorian chant when I was an undergraduate. But when I discovered that there's almost nothing written about Georgian chant, that just piqued my interest more. That became a challenge for me. Well, I've got to go find it out myself. I felt much more like an adventurer, like an explorer, like someone seeking out mysteries. And that was a good motivational force for me because when I ended up coming to Georgia, I had all of these questions that I hadn't been able to answer from the library in Wesleyan. So I arrived in Georgia full of questions, full of seeking, and I knew quite a bit about the music already from them performing the music itself, but I didn't know, there were a lot of other questions that I needed answering. So I didn't just come as a singer, I came as someone seeking to understand where the music came from.
I'm publishing this podcast in partnership with the Orthodox Arts Journal and New World Byzantine. The Orthodox Arts Journal is an online resource where you can find articles about Orthodox iconography, architecture, and music from some of the foremost pioneers in the field, such as Aidan Hart, Vladimir Morrison, and Jonathan Pajot. New World Byzantine is the architectural design firm run by Andrew Gould, who, in my estimation, is the foremost Orthodox architectural designer in North and South America, bringing together a marriage of American design and traditional Orthodox building arts. Yeah, and it's fascinating music. I mean, so I read your dissertation, and it was...
You're one of very few people that have read it.
Yeah.
I don't even know if my advisors read it.
Yeah, I just finished my own doctorate, and I realized, like, in the process, thank you, I was like, I don't think they've actually read through everything, because I kept finding mistakes that I'm like, that was a pretty blatant mistake. Like, they should have caught that, But everybody has too much to do, so it's kind of hard to. Yeah, but one of the first striking things was that the polyphony existed in Georgia way before it existed even in, like, the organum in Paris. And I was talking to Vlad Morrison actually yesterday, and we were talking about Strochnoi chant, the Russian sort of polyphonic, I guess maybe you could call it heterophony rather than polyphony or something like that. And I don't know the origin of that, but are those, and I know there's some antipathy between Russians and Georgians, and but at least we're talking about a different millennia going back. So as far as the origins are concerned, is there a relation there between Strochnoi and, if I'm saying that correctly, and early Georgian polyphony?
Not that we know of, but there's We don't know of any direct connections. Actually, sources are really limited in the history of Georgian chant. It's unlike Gregorian in the Latin West, where we have manuscripts and treatises going back to the 10th century and all these clerics and theorists, and even the Pope himself writing a papal bull saying these polyphonists are blasphemous. That those documents are gold for us because they tell us how the singers were singing and why that was offensive to other people. We don't have any of that kind of documentation in Georgia, so there's a lot of conjecture that happens among scholars, and we make educated guesses, basically. But without proof, someone else can come along later and they can have another educated guess, and we need to have a debate about it. So I'm not going to say 100% that Georgian polyphony predates the Notre Dame polyphony in Paris in the 11th, 12th centuries. In the case of Notre Dame, we have 3 manuscripts which document the polyphony exactly how they were doing it, note for note. Whereas in Georgia, we do not have such a source. So
But you have the neumes, right? Aren't there like pneumatic? There's like pneumatic manuscripts with notes above and notes below. And didn't you say there was like a saint who said, "Oh, this is in 3 parts because it represents the Trinity," and that guy was in 800 or something like that?
Okay, so I got to set a few things straight here.
Okay.
But, all right, so let's start at the beginning. The earliest reference to Georgians conducting the liturgy in their own vernacular language is from a document by Saint Saba in the Saba monastery outside Jerusalem, in which he says something to the effect of, at least on Sundays, all of the different peoples need to come to the lavra and practice together in the Greek language, including those Georgians and those others. So apparently there were Georgians at the St. Saba monastery in the 5th century practicing the liturgy in their own language. That's not a big surprise because we know that the Georgian alphabet was created in that century to translate the Gospels. And we know that in those centuries of Christianity, it was popular to make Christianity acceptable and accessible to new converted populations by translating into the vernacular and making it relevant to the people who were being converted. So, for example, Georgians were viticulturalists, so accepting a religion whose primary ritual is based around wine was a pretty easy sell. Whereas, for other cultures, it might have been more difficult. And, for Zoroastrians, they already had a relatively kind of duality of 2 gods, a light guide and a dark guide, similar to Christianity, with God in heaven and the devil below, devil in hell. And so the Christian proselytizers were trying to use existing ideas about religion and culture to make Christianity acceptable to various peoples. And so for Georgians, viticulture was important, and translating into their own languages, creating an alphabet and starting to write the Gospels and train the smartest or the most aristocratic, the sons of the aristocrats would learn to read and write, and maybe second sons would go to the church, first sons would inherit, in the feudal system that existed back then. So this is all, guesswork about that period of time when Georgian is converting to Christianity. But it's pretty clear. Do you mind if I
ask who created the Georgian alphabet? Because I was talking to an Armenian deacon about Armenian chant, and he said, "Oh, Saint so-and-so, he created our alphabet and also the Georgian alphabet, but Georgians will deny this." And I'm like, what is that about?
Well, no, the Armenians have an incredible literary history, and Mesrops Mashtots is their famous saint, who also in the 5th century, maybe late 4th century, created the Armenian alphabet. And later hagiographies of this saint, like from the Middle Ages, 10th, 12th century, I don't know specifically, they claim that he also created the Georgian alphabet and the Albanian alphabet. Not Balkan Albanians, but there used to be a Christian kingdom here in what's now Azerbaijan called the Albanians.
Okay.
But this is, medieval hagiographies tended to extrapolate, exaggerate the great deeds of the saints. I mean, we see that in every Christian tradition. The hagiography of Saint Nino, Enlightener of Georgians, from the 7th century is 1 page, and the 10th century version is 10 pages. So where someone decided there's a lot more stories to tell about this important saint, and they might have come from oral tradition. The hagiographies weren't just inventing them; they may have heard those stories, but in any case, they were, these things got extrapolated. So, did the Armenian saint create the Georgian alphabet or not? We don't know. It's offensive to Georgians that Armenians are so sure of this fact, because it follows a trend. Armenians are the Christian neighbors. Of course, they're non-Chalcedonian, so they're not in communion with the Orthodox Christians in Georgia. But Armenian culture tends to like to claim other people's achievements. It's just something. I lead tours in Armenia, and it's just something you have to take what they say tongue in cheek, kind of with a bit of humor. Everything in Armenia is the oldest shoe on the planet, the oldest carpet knot on the planet, the longest cable car, the most populous city in 100 AD was in Armenia. I mean, they are really, really excited about all the little trivia items that make them a great nation. It's a very important part of their kind of nationalistic ethnocentrism. Their education, unfortunately, is full of this. And you only find a few people that are like, it's really annoying how much Armenians need to claim about everyone. And that's why a lot of jokes about Armenians have to do with Armenians being Christian before Jesus Christ was alive, or just silly things like that. Or Jesus spoke Armenian. You will hear Armenians claim that, even though there's no historical justification for that claim, but they truly believe it. So things like
that's fascinating. I mean, I don't know the relation between Georgians, and I don't have a dog in the fight. It's all fascinating to me.
Me neither. I mean, of course, I get the stories mostly from the Georgian side, this is where I live, but I lead tours in Armenia with Armenian tour guides, and I'm fascinated by Armenian history as well. But anyway, back to the alphabets. We don't know who created it, and it doesn't really matter. It was created, and it shows that Georgians were practicing Christianity in their vernacular already by the early 400s. And they were doing so not just in Georgia, but also in monasteries throughout the Christian world, from Jerusalem to Antioch, Cyprus, up through into the Caucasus regions, of course. So those are the first references to Georgians practicing in their own language, which means they were singing in their own language, and that's what we're really talking about here. So then, further evidence of Georgian singing is these neumed manuscripts. These are manuscripts full of texts that are just meant to be sung. So hirmologions, and in Georgian they were called iadgari. It's like a sacred book full of sung texts, and some of these reflect texts that are among some of the oldest in the Christian world. So the Georgian Old Iadgari texts reflect Christian texts that were being sung in Jerusalem in the 5th century.
Hey, hit that like button.
And hardly any other manuscripts anywhere in the Christian world in any language reflect that oldest layer of hymnographical texts. And that's why biblical scholars are quite interested in these manuscripts, because elsewhere in the Greek-speaking Christian world, texts that reflected that older rite, the rite of St. James, they were destroyed in preparation for preparing the rite of Constantinople, which comes in the 11th, 12th centuries and so forth. And I'm not really a biblical scholar, so don't cite me on any of this. I didn't write my dissertation about these questions, and there are others who are expert on these questions. I would defer to, say, my advisor, Peter Jeffrey, or Daniel Galadza, who's a peer and really knows this material well, and it's of late antiquity and the sort of hymnographical transmission of that time. But suffice to say that we get these manuscripts in the 900s that have neumes on them, the little diacritical signs which indicated to a master singer what to sing where. But we think of it more as like rhythmic notation rather than something like that we would have today, descriptive notation that would show modes, melodies, and scales. It doesn't show us that. It shows us where to do something that you already know. So these master chanters had memorized all of these melodies, and these little symbols just say, this is where to do the thing you already know, because you're coming up to the end of the phrase, and this is the point where you start that kind of cadential musical melody that leads you to the cadence. So since we, as modern singers and musicologists, don't know what those model melodies were back then, or even if they were singing in polyphony at that time, we can't recreate the music they were singing. All we can do is look at those neumes and say, okay, there's some patterns here. We can do like a mathematical, paradigmatic analysis of it and say, all these texts that have a rubric saying, sing this to tone 4, they all tend to end in the same 4 neumes symbols, like all the end texts. So that shows us that tone 4 was a musical a musical rubric, which we expected anyway. That's how it is in Greek and in Rome and other places. The 8-tone system was a classification for music, for musical melodies or musical modes or musical finalis, like the final ending notes in the case of Gregorian chant. In Georgian, it seems to have been slightly different. They just had specific model melodies that they assigned to each tone. So this melody, that only occurs in tone 4 troparion. So that specific melody, at some point, Georgians just said, we're not going to sing this for other texts. We're only going to do it for tone 4. And so the 8-tone system doesn't have to do with like Greek modes or Gregorian protos, deuterus finales on D, or other sorts of ways that music theorists and music singers use that classification system to organize their material. In Georgia, it was just like organizing these sort of phrase-length model melodies and assigning them to a tone. So
it'd be more like other Slavic octoechos, right? Where it's not really a scale; it's more like a melodic formula.
Yeah.
Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's similar to that. Idiomatic phrases. So then we got those neumes. They're somewhat enigmatic. Like I said, there are symbols above the text and below, but modern scholars don't think that this reflects polyphony. That was suggested by Georgian scholars mid-century, and I covered what they said, but I don't agree with them. I think that those symbols reflected a model melody, one voice, but they could have been manifesting it as 3 voices. Now that's just more of an educated guess. So because it's hard to notate 3 voices, and vellum is a very expensive material at that time. I mean, they're abbreviating all of the words, so they're not going to spend a lot of real estate on vellum trying to figure out some notation system for 3 different voices. You know, they make one little check mark to say this is where you start that cadential musical formula.
But wasn't there a quote like super early that was like,
the quote you're alluding to is Ioane Petrizi, and that's 11th, 12th century. So after these neumes.
Oh, okay.
And he says, when he's trying to teach students about the Trinity and how it's a 3-natured entity that's actually a unison or a unity. He gives a bunch of analogies to daily life so that the students can understand the nature of this. And one of his examples is a musical one, and he names these three strings or voices. It's unclear. He said mjach, jir, and ban are like three with coming together in a unison sound. It's a very good analogy. I mean, it's one you could imagine a teacher giving today, talking about theology, trying to make sense of teaching, 3-in-1 theology. You use modern examples, and you would take like a 3-stringed instrument and say, but when you strum it, it sounds like one sound. So they're together. So that's what that was about. And musicologists and philologists have bent over backwards to claim that this was sacred polyphony. But again, it's unclear. Maybe it related to a folk instrument with 3 strings. Maybe it was relating to folk singing, which is also in 3-part harmony. Or maybe indeed it related to the sacred singing in churches. But then why didn't he have more references to it? I mean, he's writing the texts for students at a theological university at that time, the first university in Georgia. And so you would expect more references to liturgical chant if they were singing in polyphony, but we only have that one reference, and it's ambiguous.
Well, it's a funny thing, even in I was dealing with Lombardic rhythm, and then I'm trying to look for examples of where you can find Lombardic rhythm in Egalite in like ancient stuff, but it's sort of the same. I guess it's like the same mechanism. It's like, well, if everyone just understood it and everyone just did it, then they didn't need to talk about it because everybody was doing it. Yeah. You know what I mean? So I guess it could be the same, right? If everyone was just singing this way, then why would they write about it? That would be like, writing about air conditioners or something.
I mean, some cultures really wanted to record and notate and write down and be scribal and archivist, and other cultures were just more practical. They had other things to do. You go, you sing in church, then we're moving on. I'm not going to spend the rest of the day sitting around writing about what I think about singing the chant, or why it's wrong, or why it needs to be changed, and so forth. So they're just in Georgian, there was a strong oral tradition of folk singing, polyphonic 3-part harmony folk singing. It's widespread. It's in all of the mountain valleys, all the mountain regions. It's all 3-part harmony. And these people weren't necessarily communicating with each other. So the folk music manifested in 3-part polyphony feels ancient. Again, we're guessing, but considering that these people didn't communicate, they even speak different languages, they all sing 3-part harmony polyphony. So it feels like a kind of a proto-Georgian cultural element, similar to a proto-Georgian language. Before the language evolves into, there's currently 4 Georgian languages and innumerable dialects. The music also diversified as the languages split, and there's different harmonies, but it retained core elements that make them similar. Just like you can look at linguistics and say these 4 languages are similar because of these grammatical syntax elements, a musicologist can look at the 25 different types of Georgian folk music and say they're similar because of these core features, like 3-part polyphony. They're not monophonic. They're like most of the other cultures around here. I mean, ancient Persians were singing monophony. The Turks, when they arrive here, they're singing monophony. Most of the other musics to the east and south were monophonic.
I mean, I guess Byzantine, except with the Eson, but that's for all intents and purposes monophonic.
Yeah, so
as a nominee.
The Greeks, the Hellenics, they also were a monophonic musical culture. There could be a drone, but maybe that was added for the chanting in church. They did have stringed instruments with multiple voices, and they had a music theory and so forth, but It seems like the musical culture, as far as we can recreate, were bardic singers like Homer, who recited long texts and performed on musical instruments. And in the Mediterranean basin, that's kind of how things work. Polyphonic peoples, meanwhile, were in the Balkans, in the mountains, some of the Slavic peoples to the north, and throughout Europe. You have polyphonic indigenous folk traditions that far predate Gregorian chant or any other monophonic tradition. The people in villages in France were probably singing polyphony before the Notre Dame,
organum and all
performers, started doing it in church services. Where did they even get the idea to do that? They probably heard it out on the street. So in Georgia, that was the case. We have polyphonic folk music, musical culture, and at some point, the Christian melodies are brought in from the south, from Jerusalem, from Antioch, for the most part, like in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries in that period. But these melodies were received by a people who wanted to express themselves to God in a polyphonic manner. So that's the argument here among Georgian musicologists, is that probably early on, just as the Gospels were translated into the vernacular language, the received monophonic melodies were translated into the vernacular musical style. It's a pretty good argument. It's hard to argue against it, except there's no evidence. So it's
for sure the folk polyphony goes back a long way.
That's what
but
we
you
think.
Don't really know exactly, and
we don't know.
The
but
liturgical, you really don't know. But if John Graham had to take the guess, if you were a betting man and $1 million is on the table, when would you say Georgian liturgical polyphony began?
Okay, great. I'm glad you put me on the spot, because I'll just make this disclaimer. For the rest of the years that I'm alive, I have the right to change my opinion on this, because new evidence might come to light, and I will be more thrilled than anyone else. I'm not wed to any specific opinion. My opinion right now is based on everything that I've studied, everyone I've talked to, all the secondary sources that I've read, basically, everything that I've encountered. I would guess that Georgians in different regions at different times started to harmonize the melodies. It wasn't like a blanket top-down system that happened. It wasn't like someone made a decree, now everyone will sing in 3-part polyphony, I decree it, the Patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church. We have no such document that was ever made. Unlike in Rome, where the Pope did make such declarations. Everyone must not sing polyphony, says the Papal Bull of 1325 or something like that. We didn't get that in Georgia. So I think it was kind of a grassroots experimentation, in remote mountain communities, monastic communities, without widespread cultural contact. You might have multiple generations living and passing down these liturgical chants in oral tradition. And as they desired deeply to praise God in the best language that they knew how, both spoken and musical, I think that it could have been as early as 7th, 8th, 9th centuries that various communities are experimenting with singing these melodies in a polyphonic nature. So I think it exists from an early level. But it exists in the way that, it's not a perfect analogy, but in Appalachia, in the western part of your state, there's like line out singing and sacred harp singing, and people just wanting to express themselves and doing so in a polyphonic nature, because that was the culture, the musical culture that they brought with them from the British Isles. And so, and it wasn't written down for a long time, and it wasn't sung the same way from one Sunday to the next. There was a bit of kind of free-flowing, improvisatory nature to it. There was kind of conventional ways to perform it, but there was also room for improvisation or, it's a personal expression. And so you have a really good singer that's expressing themselves fully, and maybe it's a little too far, so the kind of community corrals them, brings them back into the fold of what's acceptable. But if that singer is persuasive and charismatic, they might influence the next generation. And musical generations are not like lifetime generations. You know, we tend to have kids every 20, 25, 30 years. That's what we think of as a generation. But in an oral tradition, a musical generation can be 3 years, 4 years. You know, a very influential teacher can influence a group of students every 4 years. They go out, they spread that word, they become masters of the musical tradition, and now they're not just like around you, they're now out in 4 or 5 different churches in your area, teaching another generation of students within 3, 4, 5 years. So oral tradition musical generations are a lot more frequent, and potentially wider influence in a quicker amount of time than what we typically think of as lifetime generations.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm going to say now. Is it was a grassroots process that happened in different ways in different communities throughout Georgian history, and probably doesn't become fully widespread until 1600s, 1700s. I don't know. You know, it's probably there were monophonic communities. Communities of monophonic chanters in Georgia simultaneously at the same time. And guess what? There are still today. There are still people in Georgia today in the revival post-Soviet Union who claim that the only way to express proper prayer to God is in monophonic Greek melodies with the Georgian language.
Yeah, I was talking to John Michael Boyer about this, and like we briefly mentioned, like Georgian chant, and was there any relation to Byzantine? And he was like, there are Georgians who want to do Byzantine chant, and sometimes they'll send me a message, and I'm like, do Georgian chant. Why are you trying to do Byzantine chant? It's like on my best day, Byzantine chant isn't going to sound as good as a really good 3-part Georgian choir. And so.
Well,
that begged the.
I think John Michael Boyer sounds fantastic, and his choir.
Yeah, I think he sounds great too.
And his, the amount of work that he's done pedagogically is impressive. So, Byzantine chant has its own place in heaven, so to speak. It's a praise language, and it's a deep one. But
now, is there a relation there between Byzantine chant and Georgian chant? Because
okay.
Like Znanomany, there's surely one, but it's like it gets stretched out over time until Znanomany kind of no longer looks like Byzantine. But you could go back, and so wasn't there like you'd have a Russian patriarch and then a Greek patriarch, and it would just kind of like switch every other patriarchate for like hundreds of years, and so. I just didn't know if there's a big Byzantine connection. I haven't seen anything about that. So
yeah, that's a good question, because with Znanomany chant, there's a clearer transmission. We already have Greek manuscripts at the same time that we start getting the early Russian manuscripts, and there's a clear relationship between the melodies. Of course, Znanomany goes out and evolves within a few generations, but it's a fairly well-established transmission cycle there. Unfortunately, in the case of the Georgian, it's like more mysterious. We don't have that textual transmission where we can say, there are a few points where Georgian chant meets Byzantine chant in certain historical moments, physical locations, and important individuals. And one of those is Georgian Tatsmindeli in the Iviron Monastery on Mount Athos in the early 1000s. So this particular individual, who's variously called George George of Mount Athos, or George Hagiopolite, in Georgian, Georgi Tatsmindeli. Tatsmindeli means the holy mountain. So he was the abbot, the second abbot of Ividon Monastery, very educated and erudite, translated a lot of Greek hymnographical texts into Georgian, and then wrote in the margins a lot of little notes that things like, well, I don't need to use the Greek melody for this because we already have a Georgian melody for this set of paraclesis texts, or this set of Irmoy texts for Saint Barbara that I just translated. We already have the melodies in Georgian. We already known these for 400 years. He writes things like that in the margins of 11th century manuscripts that we know were penned by him. And he's translating from Greek. So no one has actually really dug in and written a dissertation. It would be very fascinating to find 11th century Greek source material that Georgium Tatsmindeli translated from. The actual manuscripts and texts that Georgi Tatsmindeli was reading in Greek, and then we have the Georgian ones. So if someone did that comparison, and at one time I was thinking that was going to be my dissertation work, but I quickly decided to do something that was more feasible with my skill sets and time.
Well, what you did was like the overview of the preservation of Georgian chant. I mean, like, and nobody knows any of that stuff.
Yeah, and I felt like that was more relevant right now, and it's my text is an introduction to future scholars. That's what it's meant to be. And it's a starting point, and in the future, other scholars will debunk little claims that I make throughout, and that's great. That's what scholarship's supposed to be. It will hopefully outlive me, and will hopefully be useful to future scholars. But one of the things, I don't know if I wrote it in the dissertation, but I certainly alluded to in a footnote, is someone needs to find the original Greek sources and compare Georgium Tatsmindeli's translations, because that's a key to understanding his hymnographical mind and the music of that time. And scholars that study his texts, especially Western scholars, suggest that was a monophonic tradition. That Georgium Tatsmindeli in Ividon Monastery in the 11th century on Mount Athos is existing in a monophonic musical landscape. Georgian scholars contest this and say that he uses specific words that allude to multi-voice singing. But he never ever says multi-voice or polyphonic. He's always talking about model phrases, melodies. So, I would err on the conservative side and say that he was in a monophonic musical landscape at that time in that place. It was a Greek-dominated world. Mount Athos, off of Thessaloniki, Greek Orthodox Christian. The Georgians got one monastery there, but it was a Greek world, and Georgium Tatsmindeli was fluent in Greek. He was translating from Greek. He was interacting with other abbots of other prominent, wealthy monasteries, with choirs, all singing monophonic Christian chant. If the Georgians were singing three-part harmony, you would expect somewhere somebody to be like, what are they doing? It's blasphemous, sacrilegious. It's not praising God in the right way. We don't have any Greek sources that say such a thing. That would be lovely to find. If anything like that existed, that would be some solid proof that Georgians were doing something abnormal, like singing in polyphony. But there are no such references. So the conservative guess here is that they were singing monophonic chant on Mount Athos.
On Mount Athos,
yeah,
sure.
So your question, though, was connection with Byzantine Georgian. So we also don't know exactly what the Byzantines sounded like in the early 11th century on Mount Athos. Like, do scholars know what those melodies were, or the modes were, or how they performed them? I think there's quite a bit of gray area. There's a lot of debate within Byzantine Greek chant scholarship on exactly what was going on at that time. We have notation, but it doesn't tell us that much. So there's also debate about that. And then later, the later connections with Georgia are tenuous. As you go through the centuries, the Mongols invade, Tamerlane invades, Georgia is no longer a unified country under a single monarch. It splits into several feudal kingdoms, and they all have to fend for themselves by allying themselves with the Persians or the Ottomans or various entities. The dukes were largely independent, not loyal to the monarch. They were bickering and fighting and enslaving each other's peoples. It's kind of a desperate history through the 15, 16, 1700s here before the Russians arrive in 1800. It reads kind of like the Highland clans of Scotland. You killed my brother, I'm going to start a vendetta for the next 50 years. So there wasn't a lot of political cohesion through those centuries. And there were also two patriarchs of two different churches. And there were competing bishops that were loyal to their brother, who was the local feudal lord. So they were competing against the other clan, who are the feudal lords of the other region, and their bishops. These bishops, therefore, are enemies. I mean, they're part of the same church, but their brother, the king, their brother, the feudal lords, fighting the other clan. And so they didn't necessarily have much communication, even with each other within Georgia, not to mention...
Even though they're in communion.
Empire. Yeah. And the Byzantine Empire, after 1453 and the fall of Constantinople, to what extent were they projecting liturgical art beyond their boundaries? I mean, we don't get much Byzantine painting in Georgia after the fall of Constantinople. We don't have Byzantine manuscripts. We don't have the projection of any political power. So it's unlikely that we would have had the projection of any Byzantine liturgical music into the far peripheries of the Byzantine Empire, especially after the fall of Constantinople. So I would say the reference points and relationships between Georgian chant and Byzantine chant are very slim, very fragile, very few particular moments in history where there's contact. One of the one that John Michael Boyer was referring to, which is amusing to both of us, is that after 1990, when the Georgian church went into revival mode, after the fall of the Soviet Union, everyone had to reinvent liturgical culture because it had been suppressed. People just didn't know how to behave. How do we venerate an icon? How do we, what do we wear in church? Like, are we allowed to answer phones in church? Just like basic culture questions were unknown and needed to be reinvented. And so certain charismatic leaders in the Georgian church emerged to give guidance, and they went to Mount Athos seeking good examples. So a lot of the revival kind of orthodoxy in Georgia follows a model from Mount Athos and is therefore pretty strict in its observance of rules and, crossing legs, crossing oneself when you see a church, fasting rules. These types of, cultural elements of the practice of orthodoxy are in a revivalist, strict kind of conservative mode right now, I would say. And one of the interesting things that emerged from this whole milieu of an Orthodox cultural revival was that some charismatic priests and singers said the only true Orthodox chant is Byzantine chant. And they took as their reference like the hymnal of 1820, the Byzantine hymnal of 1820, which is pretty modern if you ask me. And they set all of those Byzantine melodies with Georgian liturgical texts, and they started singing them well. They sound great. They sound like Byzantine chanters. So you listen closely, and they're singing the Georgian language. They put out a few CDs, and their churches were popular among parishes. And they had contact with Svetitskhoveli Monastery, Mount Athos, and other places. And, then people start writing to John Michael Boyer saying, it's amusing. The patriarch, though, put a stamp on that. The patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church, His Holiness Ilya II, I think it was in 2000 or 2001, he wrote a decree saying, enough of that. Only inherited Georgian three-part harmony chant is to be sung in Georgian Orthodox churches.
Great. I love Byzantine chant, but it's like,
but it's,
as John Michael Boyer said, God forbid if the Georgians lose their chant. You know?
Yeah, but, you know, people ignored the order. It's still being sung. And you go around in churches and there's all sorts of different ways that people are praising God here. The Georgians are not really into like policing their parishes. So the control from the patriarchate, as far as I can tell, is pretty lax.
Interesting.
It goes down to a bishop level. And there's 35 bishops and they're all very different. And so some of them like this music, some of them like that music.
Well, not all Athenites, you know, are the same. I mean,
absolutely.
There's like a monastery in Germany where there was a bunch of monks who went from Mount Athos and they said, let's resurrect an ancient style of a German chant. Do you know about this? And they created their own German style of chant and then put all of their liturgical texts and they sing them in this like pre-species counterpoint where it's still fourths and fifths, but it sounds like organum, and they're all like monks from Athos, and so you know, at least there's a continuum of conservatism with regards to musical style.
I would like to find the reference to that because I wonder if they're using there was a manuscript, a very early manuscript, Encyclopediades or something like that, which shows parallel fifth harmonization of Gregorian melodies pretty convincingly. I think it was from Switzerland, but it's, you know, Germanic, medieval Germanic, like 10th, 11th century.
I think it's like Heilig Geist Kloster or something. But
okay,
I'll find it and I'll send it to you because it's very fascinating. With regards to like preservation, I did want to ask, how much is the harmony improvised and how much is the harmony sort of set? Because obviously when some of these, I'm sure I'm pronouncing the names wrong, like Karasolidze and some of these other like priests who painstakingly went through and recorded some of these things and then also like transcribed some of these things, it would seem to give the impression, oh, this is the traditional harmony for this tune. But then I know from other traditions like Carpatho-Rusin, it's like they do everything in harmony, but it's all sort of improvised by the congregation while they're singing it. So how strict is the harmony for these chants? Because isn't it like between like Gelati and is it Shemokhmedi? Is that how you say it?
Shemokhmedi. Yeah, and then the like third one, Svetitskhoveli.
Yeah. Svetitskhoveli, yeah.
Those are the three schools. No, this is a really good question. Really good question, and this is one that that my dissertation tries to answer. And I think scholars, through the right using the right analytical tools, we can answer this question definitively. Unlike all the questions that we've been tackling in this interview so far, which exists in a very gray, vague, conjectural era, you know. But when it comes to the no, but these are the fascinating questions, the $1 million questions. You know, when did monophonic chant become polyphonic in Georgia? Because as we received it in 1800, it's already this fully developed, sophisticated polyphonic chant tradition, like the folk music, even more complicated than the folk music. So it must have developed some point in the Middle Ages. We just don't know where, when, how. Actually, the how we can kind of analyze, and that has to do with this question about how much of it, the harmony, is improvised or not. So I was really interested in that. Like, how does this chant work from a theoretical perspective? And there's some excellent Georgian scholarship on this question, like a dissertation by Dato Shugliashvili, which goes through painstakingly every single melodic fragment and says, and shows its taxonomy, what it's assigned to in the 8-tone system, which textual genre. Is it 8-tone Choparian, Kondakian, Alleluias, or other genres? Each of them had a set of melodies for each tone, and there was, I think he estimated something like 300 to 400 phrase length model melodies that are unique and distinct from one another. And a master chanter needed to know all of those, 400, let's say. It's not insurmountable. I mean, someone that sings jazz probably knows that many, just any musical tradition. That's something that is feasible for the human memory. Now, these chanters also claim that they knew 3,000 chants by heart. That's stretching it, because each one of these chants could take me a week to learn. Some of them are really complicated. Having 3,000 in your head, not so likely. So what they really...
I will say, I had like a really good, like amazing jazz saxophonist friend. And he told me that, because I was asking about transcribing, because I was trying to do a little bit of jazz transcription. And he said, well, if you want to be good and you want to gig, you really need at least 500 to 1,000 solos memorized or transcribed. And he said, but all of the big guys, they've got at least 8 to 10,000 solos memorized.
Yeah.
And I'm like, serious? Like, so maybe, All
right,
but like
so...
all he did was transcription. It's like all day long he's just memorizing, what did Brad Mehldau do on this tune? And what did Dizzy Gillespie do on this tune? And
I mean, it's incredible what people focused on what a single tradition can do. The human mind, and especially in this pre-literate era, before people were reading, the best minds in society would become the bards, would become the purveyors of cultural knowledge. They would tell the stories of the kings, or they would memorize the Homeric epics, or in the case of the medieval Georgian Orthodox Church, they would apprentice with the local master chanter and memorize, and so that they would become the master chanter for the next generation. So we know that the system is based on model melodies in the top voice. And that was what was transmitted first. And then there was a practice of learning how to harmonize those model melodies with 2 lower voice parts. And in each musical region of the country, the harmonization process occurred differently. In the late 1800s, when scholars and musicologists went out to find the last master chanters and notate their oral tradition into European notation, they only really recorded 3 schools, the ones we just mentioned, Gelati, Shemokhmedi, and Svetitskhoveli. But we know that there were other schools that are just lost. Like Svaneti is a highland mountain region, and we have 4 or 5 chants that survived in oral tradition up till now. But there would have been a whole liturgy sung in the Svanetian tonality and harmony and harmonization of the model melodies, and it was never notated, unfortunately, so we lost it. So we know that the structure was around learning model melodies and then a practice of learning how to harmonize in very basic manner the bass voice and the middle voice below the top voice melody. And then once you became a master, you would learn how to ornament all 3 voice parts. And that's where the real virtuosity came into play. So that's my analysis. That's my answer to that question. And basically, how much improvisation is there? Not too much. It's not jazz improvisation. I would use the term ornamentation. So they take let's take an example, the most famous chant, Shen Charvenachi. Everyone thinks the melody is in the middle. Shemokhmedi, because it's moving, it's liquid, it's melismatic. Actually, no.
Which, if people don't know, that's the "Thou art the vineyard" that every OCA church does the Cherubic hymn to.
Oh, yeah.
That a lot of the Georgians hate because they're like, we got Cherubic hymns. Why don't you do one of our Cherubic hymns, right?
I mean, just on a tangent on that, the cherubic hymn has a specific melody that it must be sung to. The cherubic text must be sung to this melody. It's not in the 8-tone system. It's not a movable melody that you get to just choose. But somebody in Russia took the Shemokhmedi music and stuck the cherubic text on it in Russian, and then it got translated into English. And because the music's beautiful, it became the English or the Georgian cherubic hymn. But whatever, I'm not here as like Orthodox liturgical chant police. You know, I can share what I know about the tradition, and then people can make their own decisions. But we have beautiful Georgian music for the cherubic hymn text. Why not sing the Georgian music that we have that from oral tradition? Anyway, back to Shemokhmedi. So that the melody is actually in the top voice. Shemokhmedi. And this melody is tone 6 troparion melody, which we can find lots of texts are set to that melody. Other texts that must be singing tone 6. And so the basic harmonization of the melody would not be as flowery as the version that we sing now a lot. It would have just been parallel thirds below. Super simple. And but there was one gentleman named Vasil Karbalashvili who inherited that music through his family. He learned notation in Moscow conservatory for a year, and then he spent the rest of his life notating his own family tradition, which he had in his head.
Was this the opera singer, or this was a different guy?
This is an East Georgian singer.
Oh, okay.
So in his manuscripts, he writes down this chant, Shemokhmedi, and they published it in 1898. But in his rough drafts, there's like 5 or 6 versions. In those versions, there's all different sort of middle voice ornamentations. So instead of singing just the basic blocky harmonization of the melody in parallel thirds, Vasil writes in all of the noodles and doodles that I call them. Instead of just Shemokhmedi, he's like, what else can I do? Shemokhmedi. He write that, and then he's like, okay, here's another one. And then, so he was improvising that, if you can call it. I prefer the word ornamenting. So he has a basic movement of the voice. It's only a harmonizing voice, so it's not even the most important voice, as I've said. And then he's just trying to see how he can make it more colorful, more ornamental. And he basically uses upper neighbor notes, lower neighbor notes, little motifs, little up, da 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 da. You hear that, little groups of 4. The noodling and doodling, and we see it in his.
And that's what people think the melody is.
Yeah, and the manuscripts are so clear on this. The first voice is written first, and you see it throughout the manuscript. Even rough drafts that were unfinished, the first voice is there. The second, he would write the bass voice, and it's often quite simple, just parallel fifths and octaves to the melody. So, that's his bass voice. Later it got simplified to just Shemokhmedi, as that was a 20th century arrangement of the original Karbalashvilis. Now, basically what I'm trying to say with all this is the top voice is a canonical melody that's assigned to the 8-tone system with rubrics, and this melody is unique and only fits whatever classification it's given. It cannot be sung to tone 5 or tone 4 or tone 3, Kondakian or Troparian or anything else. Only tone 6, Troparian, this little melodic fragment that we've been playing with. And then the way they harmonized was they would teach kids just basic parallelisms, and then they would use a basic counterpoint, and then the masters would ornament it. And they would ornament it in fantastic ways. And all of this is clear to see once you get under the piles of manuscript all the manuscripts, pages, the rough drafts. And that's what I spent my 10,000 hours doing. I went through all 20,000 pages of music manuscripts in the archives, all the rough drafts. And I really got to know the repertory's basic structure that way, because many of the good copies that were written down like the rough drafts are 1880s, and then the good copies written down in 1900s, and they were printed. So we have printed books from that period, from the first decade of the 20th century, and they would print and they would write in good copy the most complicated variants. So you would think that all of the chant is extremely difficult and complicated. But when you get into the rough drafts, you realize, no, there's like the different levels to this. There's what kids would learn, then there's what advanced students would learn, and then there's what like 70-year-old master chanters who've been singing there and teaching their entire lives. Then there's what they would sing, especially when there's an opera singer, ready to write down their thing. You better bet they're going to sing their absolute best variant. And then that variant got frozen in time. It got published. And then 100 years later, we're sitting around talking about that variant that was actually just the top master chanter's best improvisation on that particular day, best ornamentation. The basic.
But the harmony would have basically been set in stone, and the melody. So, just making sure I understand this correctly. So, like between the three major schools, the melody is 99% the same between all three schools.
That's right.
Maybe with an exception here or there, but it's basically the same.
That's
and
right.
then the harmony is treated differently between the three different schools.
That's right.
And then the ornamentation can sometimes be kind of wildly different between the schools.
Wildly different, yes. I mean, in West Georgia, in Gelati and Shemokhmedi schools in West Georgia, one of the ornament techniques that they use is called voice crossing, gada drada dineba in Georgian, and it's literally to go across oneself is how you would translate it. It has the word jvari in it, which it means cross, and so the first voice goes below the second voice. Second voice has to respond and go above, and then they come back at the cadence. So they got, they're passing each other. And a lot of the advanced chant variants that were notated in the 1880s and 90s reflect this highly advanced ornamentation technique, which you would certainly not teach students. I mean, this was not what you were teaching the kids. It's difficult to perform. And when you do these voice crossings, you actually abandon the model melody. The canonical top voice melody, which has been handed down by generations of master singers and which is not supposed to be changed. When they do this particular advanced ornamentation technique, they abandon it. They don't sing it. We're not hearing it. No one's singing the melody. That's why it's really cool, in my opinion, because they all know it. All these advanced singers, they know that canonical melody. They absolutely know it. They've been singing it their whole lives. And they are choosing not to do it then just to amuse themselves. And they always finish in time on the right cadence notes. So there's some other structural components to Georgian chant which start to feel a little more like jazz. When you're in jazz, you have to have a strict structure or else no one can improvise. Like, we don't know where we're going if we don't have some kind of structure, and that's usually in the chord chart, and it's in the number of beats before we get to this cadential chord, where we're going to start a B section, or we're going to go back to the A section, or we're going to start a bridge or something else. There's a structure behind the music, and Georgian chant definitely has those elements. So even if they abandon the model melody, they maintain a strict rhythmic pattern, the final cadential note must end where the model melody would have ended. So even if they divert, they will come back in time on the right pitch.
And then all end in unison.
Either in unison, or the medial cadences within the chant text are usually an open fifth. And then the final chord of the text is often a unison.
It's crazy because listening to it, there, you expect thirds and stuff, and there's like almost never, major thirds, or at least not in any big cadential point. And there's all these fourths and parallel fourths and these like open fifths stacked on top of each other, so you have ninths everywhere. And it sounds like Prokofiev was just playing around with writing choral music, in the mid 20th century or something. Like, it doesn't, on initial hearing, you're like, oh, this is like modern choral music, but it's at least centuries and centuries old. And so how much of those, like the stacked fifths and the stacked fourths was just the sound that was, I don't know if this is a good question or not, but sound intrinsic to their aesthetic, versus how much of it came from like their tuning system, because they didn't have equal temperament, right?
Right.
And so it was more of like a heptatonic system,
right?
Maybe like Byzantine kind of, but
lots
of conflicting opinions on how Byzantine chant is supposed to be tuned. But
so there's a couple of questions there. Basically the harmony and how it exists, how it was received in the 1800s in these three different chant schools that we happen to have notated. The key to understanding that harmony is in the local folk musics. That is the only way to understand the harmony there. When you go to Shemokhmedi monastery is in the region of Guria. And to understand why the master chanters there would harmonize a melody with two stacked fifths. Melody here, middle voice a fifth below, and the bass voice a ninth below the melody. And I love
it. Sounds great.
That's their most consonant chord. That is the chord that they sing the most important syllable of the most important word on. That is the musical climax of the phrase. They choose that chord as opposed to any other one. So why would they do that? You have to go to the folk music of Guria, because that's what they do. It's in the folk music. It's in their musical ear. It's in their vernacular musical idiom. And so that's why they want to praise God that way. That's the best way I can explain that. Okay, they want to sing the Troparion to St. George. And this is from West Georgia, so it'll sound a lot different. It was recorded in 1966 by one man. He sang all three voice parts on a cassette tape in the conservatory. Because no one else alive knew this version of this chant. It was the middle of the Soviet period, and he was 80 years old when we recorded this, so we're lucky to have this. Normally on St. George's Day, we sing the standard style from the Gelati monastery. This is a rare style. No one really sings it, so that's why we might need the references notation. And then the tuning system, we know that about the tuning system because we have recordings of it from the early 20th century when the English gramophone company was here trying to sell gramophones. They went and recorded villagers because they knew that lots of people that were urbanizing to the cities were more likely to buy these machines that would play music, the gramophones, if they could listen to the village music. That's what the consumers had said. They said, we want to hear the music from our village. So these entrepreneurs said, all right, we'll provide it. They went to the village, they recorded random groups. They weren't like ethnomusicologists, they weren't like seeking out the best or anything. They showed up in one village, they recorded 50, 60, 70 songs. Then they came back, made some discs, sold some gramophones. So these things are priceless for us, of course, but one wishes that they had been a little more thorough. Maybe they could have recorded more women. Maybe they could have recorded some instruments. Maybe they could have recorded a funeral. Of course, they're not going to sell gramophones with a recording of a funeral, but as an ethnomusicologist 100 years later, I would have loved to have heard that,
Of course, yeah.
Or a church service. They never recorded a church service. The chants that we have, there are only 4.5 recordings out of 200. Most of the music they recorded was folk music. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is the tuning system that those singers were singing in is totally different than what we're used to in the West. It doesn't have half steps or whole steps. So if a half step is 100 cents and a whole step is 200 cents, so an octave is 1,200 cents, the Georgian intervals are between 150 and 170.
Okay.
So that's why we call them 3/4 steps. A half step's 100, whole step's 200. These are like 160, like in that range. And this has all been mapped out on computers now very thoroughly by a team of, there's actually a really interesting scholar named Frank Scherbaum from Germany. He's a seismologist. He spent his career studying audio waves to understand earthquakes and seismic audio activity in the earth crust. He brought that tech to his retirement project of studying the Georgian tuning system. And he's done incredible work over the last 15 years or so. And our understanding of the Georgian tuning system is now at a sophisticated sort of computer modeled level, and not just like your opinion versus my opinion based on what our ears telling us. So that's been really fascinating to get that confirmation of what our ears were telling us. But Frank and his team have really mapped it out at like a super detailed level and created scales and graphs that really show how Georgian singers were tuning in a scale by themselves, but mostly they're singing in a polyphonic context. So how are they tuning chords? That's more what's happening. I could sing you a Georgian tuned scale approximately right now, but when I try and do it with other singers, it's so difficult. It doesn't sound right. It doesn't even sound like the old Georgian singers. It's very difficult to reproduce, and that's why there's hardly any choirs that sing this. So, we have major third, ba-da-da, minor third, ba-da-da. This 3/4 would not want us to do a whole step and a minor third and a fourth. Ba da da da. They would want that. Ba da 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 da. So it's like it's a neutral third there. Fourths are pretty consonant. Fifths are very consonant, because fifths are synchronizing vibrational waves, and at least for liturgical chanters, they're singing in stone chapels where you want your frequencies lining up. So fifths tend to be pure.
Well, it's the first overtones, so it's kind of like Bernstein's whole like lecture where he goes through and he's talking about like musical development follows the course of the overtone series. And so it's like octaves, so you first get people in octaves, and then it's fifths, and so you get that, and then I guess then another fifth makes the ninth, And so it's not until like jazz is like really late where you have like the flat seventh, and then you have like sharp 11 and that sort of thing. And so it kind of makes sense that, if you go to a proto musical system, that it would be like fifths would be the same. Because it's it clicks in the harmonic series.
A consonant, like a very strong, solid chord, absolutely. And a lot of Georgian folk music is based on the fifth. And that's why you get stacked fifths. And there are always neutral thirds in between. So the closest approximation is a Mixolydian scale. It has a Mixolydian scale, major third, major six, but flat seven. But those thirds and sixths should be sung neutral if one was attempting to do Georgian tuning. And,
interesting.
And
that created a lot of problems for transcribing it, right? Because how do you write it?
I end up spending a lot of time writing about that, because I was also, since 2004, I've been a minor editor on the republication of these manuscripts. So my role is just checking English titles and things like that. But I've gotten to be in the room with editors who were taking manuscripts from 100 years ago and saying, we're going to publish this now in 2004. And there are a bunch of mistakes from 100 years ago. So says an editor now, but it's really his opinion. And I say, well, on what justification are you going to just change the ficta? Like, just, this is no longer B flat, we're going to make it a B natural. F sharp, F natural. Tons of changes like that were made to the original manuscripts when we republished them in the last 2 decades. And they had to do with modern scholars' understanding of the tuning system and saying, we think we know better how Georgian music used to be tuned than those guys 100 years ago who were listening to it in the room. They were hearing Georgian tuning, but they didn't know how to compromise. They didn't know how to write it into Western notation in an accurate compromise. We think we now, in 2004, know how to do that better. So this is, there's some hubris to it, but at least the modern chant books that I've worked on, there's a method to the redaction, to the editing. There's a method to it, and it's mostly to set as many Georgian chants as possible into the Mixolydian modal scale, because that most approximates the Georgian tuning system of that period. The original transcriptions from the 1880s and 90s, they weren't consistent because the transcriber was trying to write down quickly what 3 guys were like singing at him, and every time they sang it, they would sing it a different way because they were an oral tradition. and they were like, why should I sing it the same way? That's boring. These are like jazz musicians. You never play the same solo the exact same way. That's not the idiom. You're supposed to have expression. How am I feeling today? That's how I'm going to express this music. So that was frustrating for the transcribers. And in a lot of the rough drafts, which I talk about in the dissertation, they start with 3 sharps and then they'll cross them out, or they'll, in the middle of a phrase, they'll add, extra ficta or cross it out or erase it, or afterwards when it's transcribed from rough copy to good copy to get ready for printing, they change this key signature again. So there was a lot of like trying to figure out how to take this Georgian tuning system and map it onto a musical technology that came from a totally different musical system, which is Western Europe, with diatonic and chromatic tuning and so forth. It was not a perfect match with the way that Georgians were singing.
Now, I know, like, I have a Syriac hymnal that's like relatively recent, and he writes everything according to the Syriac modes, but he'll put in the guy's name is Gabriel Aydin, and it's like the first Syriac hymnal in Western music notation. And in the key signature, he would put like the E flat with the little 3 on it, or like B flat with like 2 on it, and it would signify how many microtones it was supposed to be off. So why would or wouldn't you, in like modern, editions of this music, adopt some sort of practice like that might be able to sort of mitigate the differences between the 2 different temperament systems and how that sort of
it's a good
notational
question.
system? Because I think you could do that. It would just be a big pain.
I agree. You could do it, and it, some sort of scholarly edition could maybe make a stab at that. But the aim of these publications so far has been practical. We want to get this music into every church in front of choirs and get them singing it. So the easiest methods possible. And then scholars and a few very scholarly choirs will attempt to do the traditional Georgian tuning, and they'll put out a CD of this attempt, and it just doesn't catch on. Now, Georgians are steeped in tempered music now with radio, TV,
Would Anchescati, that would be trying to do it in the original?
Anchescati were the first, that's right. They tried to sing the Georgian chant in Georgian tuning. But honestly, most of their CDs are in tempered tuning. But it was members of that group that tried to experiment with the tuning, and especially in their folk music. And then in some of the splinter groups that came out of Anchescati, some of the student groups, that's where we really Malchazer Kvanidze, the former director of Anchishkati Church Choir, he's the one that's been really pushing his student choirs to try and sing the old tuning technique in liturgical chant and not just folk music. This tuning style is mostly heard now in folk music. That's where Georgian singers feel a little more free to try and pick up the timbral nuances of a specific region, and one of the nuances is to try and capture the tuning technique of a specific region. Not just the sort of brilliance or darkness or brightness of the vocal timbre, but also the tuning and the language. We have these different languages. Like, let's just take Svaneti. High northwest mountain region, secluded from society until the Soviets brought in electrification in like 1940s or 50s. I mean, it was like Stone Age up there until the 1940s and 50s. And barely any contact with the lowlanders. So they had their own language, which split from Georgian thousands of years ago. They sing three-part harmony, but it's very different from any other region in Georgia. As I mentioned already, their liturgical chant system was not written down, unfortunately. So the oral tradition died. We only have a few exemplars, 4 or 5 Svanetian chants. One of them is the famous Christ is Risen that everyone sings.
Interesting.
Yeah, but what I was trying to say is, when lowland choirs now, like in Tbilisi, when they sing a Svanetian folk song, they are singing in the Svan language. They will sing in a Svan timbre, which is different. And they will try and sing in a Svan tuning, which is different. And that's what gives the song authenticity to its origins. And if the lowland choirs don't even attempt to do any of those things, it doesn't sound Svan and doesn't convince any audience down here that they've done a good job. It sounds amateurish. If you're a folk music ensemble worth your salt in Georgia today, you have to try and pick up some of the nuances of the regional dialect of the music that you're singing. Just imagine singing an Appalachian tune without an Appalachian accent. It's not quite an Appalachian tune, is it? It needs an accent, like the way that the original person sang it. It needs a twang, like a timbral It needs a little ornaments that make that an Appalachian song and not something from Oregon or New Hampshire. The regional musical styles make a difference in their performance practice.
Yeah,
So
interesting.
so that's where tuning is, where you really hear more Georgians trying to attempt the old tuning is in the folk style performance practice, less so in liturgical chant. Even today, if you went to Anchishkhati Church this Sunday, they're going to be singing in tempered tuning, unfortunately. So but it's just hard. It's hard to pull off. We can hear it in the old recordings, but try and manifest it. It's very difficult.
Yeah, sounds like it. And the music, when you talk about it being lost, it was lost due to mainly two reasons, right? Like it was sort of was it like the imperial Russian, like during the 19th century, but then also the Bolshevik Revolution during the 20th century, and sort of those were like the two big whammies that kind of took out all of the music and made Christianity mostly illegal, and before that, like Imperial Russia tried to squash all of the idiosyncrasies of the chant, and so like that's the reason that we've lost so many of the chants, right? Those two sort of factors.
Yeah, I write about that in the introductory chapters to the dissertation. Why was the oral tradition in decline and almost lost in the 1880s? Like, what are the societal factors for that decline? Certainly, the Russian Empire was a colonial empire, feudal system, plus a religious empire. So they usurped the Georgian Orthodox Church into the Russian Orthodox Church. They didn't honor the autocephaly of the Georgian Orthodox Church. They invited the patriarch to Russia, and he lived out his days in exile, and no new patriarch was appointed after 1810. The whole Georgian Orthodox Church was ruled by an exarch, an appointee from St. Petersburg. And they ran it as part of an empire, and the seminaries were conducted in Russian, and chant, by and large, was Slavonic chant. So there was a Russian hegemonization process that went on throughout the 1800s. So the only pockets of Georgian chant that survive, again, in these decades, it's an oral tradition only. The pockets where it survives were particular families that lived beyond the reach of the empire in small villages. And they were priestly families that were master chanters and made sure that they taught next generations. But by the 1880s, there were very few of these families left. No, very few. So, and they almost all die out before the Bolsheviks even arrive. So there are a lot of factors, though. You can't just blame the Russian Empire. There was also a urbanization movement. I mean, lots of the villages were emptying as people went to work in factories and make a better life for their kids in urban centers. Similar to what we saw in the United States and around Europe, Industrial Revolution. It wasn't to that extent in Georgia, but there were certainly the same kind of trends. And when that happens, you lose half your population in your village, half your singers or your students or half your parish left. It just decreases the amount of continuity that one has in rural communities where liturgical arts tend to thrive. Rural communities, of course, there's always the big seminary and the big well-funded church in the capital city, but that's also where reforms happen, historically speaking. The big capital cities are where every generation there's some big reform, and people get moved in and out of the heads of liturgical institutions like seminaries or cathedrals or what have you. So it's really rural locations where one sees the continuity of culture through centuries, especially when it comes to oral tradition. And that's definitely the case in Georgia. So I would say, I write about this in the dissertation too, it's not just Russian Empire, it's urbanization and just globalization, global change, and a changing of priorities for the most advantaged Georgians. So the children of landowners and aristocrats now in the 1800s have choices. They don't. The only musical tradition to learn is not just liturgical chant or Georgian folk music. They're being exposed to Tchaikovsky, to Verdi. There's an opera house from 1849 onwards in Tbilisi with just nonstop performers coming through the Tsarist Empire. So that exposure, you get a lot of the most talented, most advantaged members of society saying, I'm going to play fortepiano now. I'm going to learn Italian art song, So there was just a natural globalization at that period as well. It wasn't full-on suppression, though suppression also happened, especially in the seminaries.
Wow. Yeah, I remember reading one story, and it was just heartbreaking in your dissertation where there was like I forget the guy's name. Maybe you can you'll know immediately who I'm talking about. He became a monk, and then all the other monks thought that it was super dumb that he was just transcribing Georgian chant all the time. And then eventually, like, the revolution takes place, and he still keeps working away, but he's burying some of them in his yard, and his priest friend, he gives them for safekeeping, some of these manuscripts, and he tries to sell them and not give them back to him because, what was that guy's name? Do you mind recounting a little bit of that story?
No, this is just the amazing story that led me down this rabbit hole of the history of the transmission of Georgian church chant. When I just couldn't believe this whole story when I found it. I mean,
it was like a Dostoevsky novel.
Yeah, it's an incredible story, and I tried to do it justice, but it really deserves its own book. One of these days. So when I came on a Fulbright in 2004, I started to live in Tbilisi, and I met a lot of chanters, and I met a good friend of mine, Luarsab Togonidze, who's a chant scholar and my godfather now. And we started working on a translation of the memoir of the monk that you're talking about, whose name is Saint Eftime the Confessor Karaselidze. And he wrote this memoir in 1941. He dies in 44, and from old age. And he writes the title of his memoir is kind of like the title of my dissertation. It's like the history of the transmission of Georgian chant. And he writes from his perspective, everyone that he met. And it's an incredible life story. I mean, you just alluded to some of the highlights where he inherited all of the rough draft transcriptions. He didn't write them. He was not a trained musician. He was a simple, uneducated worker in a printing house. He would set like letter A, letter B. He was the guy that set the typescript. But he fell in love with Georgian chant, and he was self-educated with some other guys. They formed a club, and they hired a chanter to come and teach them to sing. And in any case, the press dissolved. Everyone that was involved died. And this humble press worker finds himself with piles of manuscripts, the same ones that 100 years later I studied and wrote my dissertation about. And so what does he do with them? He decides to become a monk, like you said, moves to a monastery, organizes them, rewrites them all in beautiful scribal sort of white copy or good draft copy. He had the goal of eventually publishing them all, but he couldn't do it in his lifetime. So that's what we finally did starting in 2004. We've now published all of his good copies and all of the rough drafts that were unpublished, we've also published now. But yeah, at certain points, I mean, he lived through the Bolshevik crises, the terrors of 1924. That's when he buried those manuscripts in tin boxes underground. He was constantly under fear that he would be killed because many other people were killed. I mentioned earlier in this discussion the Karbalashvili family, who were the ones who transmitted the famous chant Shen Charvanachi that we were discussing. So two of them get killed in 1924. Two of the five brothers who are now saints, they just get rounded up with some other villagers and shot for no reason other than that they were wearing black cassocks in 1924. And they were old men. They were like these Andrea and Petre Karbalashvili were 65 and 72 years old in 1924. And not a threat to society in any way, but they were killed like a lot of other monastics. So Eftimie Keresalidze, with all the rough draft transcriptions, was really rightfully afraid for his life. But luckily he was found by some museum director in 1936 who convinced, at this point, the old monk, Eftimie, to give up the manuscripts. And that museum director put them in the National Archive and didn't label the manuscripts accurately.
Really?
He didn't say, like Orthodox Christian texts with, he didn't catalog. He gave them each a number like Q696. That's it. It's just like a random number, like 35 big manuscripts and loose leaf folders and like 20,000 pages. 1936, go into the archive by this archive director, who then gets shot the next year by Beria. 1937, this museum director, Dmitry Shevardnadze, he's eliminated, so hardly anyone remembers that these manuscripts are there. Our old monk up in the monastery on the mountain, he writes his memoir, the one that I started translating in 2004, and then he dies of old age in that monastery alone, and he's buried there to this day. And he was canonized in 2003, I think. Karbalashvili brothers were canonized in 2013. I don't think that museum director has been canonized, but in any case, it was a very narrow, hourglass of a moment when these manuscripts, if they've been discovered by the wrong person, they could have just been in the bonfire, and that would have been hundreds of years of musical oral tradition transmitted by generations of singers in multiple regions and schools of Georgia just go up in smoke, because there was only one copy at that time in the 1920s and 1930s, and there was only one monk paying attention to this whole tradition. Thank God, though. It went in the archives. Anchishati choir members found them like 1980s, and we started publishing them in the early 2000s. Now there are thousands of people that have access to this music, either in their written transcription, published form, their PDFs for free online, countless recordings and CDs and YouTube videos and Spotify, MP4s. So the tradition's no longer as fragile. It's in a good state right now. And the most important thing is people love Georgian chant, people sing Georgian chant, and I just feel like, one person in a long lineage of people that have loved this music. After me, there will be many more that love it. So my role is just like a conduit. I'm just another transmitter. And I'm doing the way that I can, which is to write about it in a language that's accessible to more people in the world, English in this case. I teach foreign choirs. I lecture about this topic. It's not how I make a living. It's just what I love to do, and I love this topic.
Is the tours how you mostly make your living?
Yeah, that's the only way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But I always bring in Georgian chant. If anyone gets me talking about my dissertation, can spend a whole bus ride talking about that. And I always try and teach some Georgian folk music or chant as well to anyone who comes on a tour and wants to learn it. And often people do. Often we get a small choir going, because the tours are usually 12, 13 days, and it's enough time if you have 3, 4, 5 singers to learn a few polyphonic pieces. Well, listen,
hey, thank you for spending the time talking to me today. This was great. It was, I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time.
No, it's really nice, because I rarely get to talk about, the whole picture of it. So I appreciate you giving me so much attention.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I super appreciate you coming on, and hope to talk again.
Absolutely. All right. Let's do another one sometime.
Thanks. Davida.
Do you like Bach? I know you like Bach. You should buy a copy of my CD, Bach's Klavierübung Dritte Teil, at the Waltershausen Trostorgan, which you can purchase on my website, MatthewWilkinson.net. There is a link below.